昔は我々は地球とつながっていました。最近、良くも悪くもお互いにつながっています。
Cyberpunk Red is a tabletop RPG published by Talsorian Games in 2020 and is coincidentally an update to their previous game in the same setting called Cyberpunk 2020, which was published in 1990. And just for some added confusion, that game was an update to Cyberpunk 2013, which was published in 1988. But Cyberpunk Red takes place in 2045 and was released alongside a video game called Cyberpunk 2077. When the quick start for Cyberpunk Red came out, I actually reviewed it on this channel and wasn't very impressed at the time. I concluded that it just didn't bring much new to the table, and I just sort of ignored the core rulebook when it came out. But then a couple of things happened over the years. One, the companion video game, Cyberpunk 27, which was released by the game studio CG Projekt Red, with a bunch of bugs and glitches, eventually got fixed and became a fully polished single-player CRPG adventure experience that immersed you in the official setting. And two, the anime series Edge Runners by Studio Trigger was released by Netflix and ended up being a particularly entertaining, thought-provoking, and faithful exploration of the main themes of Cyberpunk. And all the while, Talsorian Games had been publishing free monthly content for Cyberpunk Red, as well as several important supplements that expanded the game's gear and offered some really interesting adventures and NPCs. So by the time I sat down to consume this huge collection of media that had amassed itself since the RPG's release, it was like an overwhelming flood of data being injected into my prefrontal lobe. And after running the actual game and interviewing some veterans of the newer edition, I came to the conclusion that Cyberpunk Red is important if you are into the cyberpunk genre. And as it turns out, most every Cyberpunk RPG that has come out since Cyberpunk 2013 borrows, leans, or in some way echoes the Talsorian Games' original setting or themes in some way. Cyberpunk, trademark, established a lingua franca for the entire genre. I wouldn't say that Cyberpunk Red itself is so important that you have to buy it and play it more than other great Cyberpunk RPGs that are out there at this point. But if you want to inform yourself on the foundations of the genre and tap into a lore that feels almost quintessential at this point, you owe it to yourself to at least read this core rulebook. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the character creation and mechanics as presented in the core rulebook, and after that show you a few of the ways that Talsorian Games has gone above and beyond other Cyberpunk game creators in a way that makes Cyberpunk Red a very compelling ecosystem to participate in. Some of those things include monthly free content for the game and multimedia partnerships where they've maintained perfect continuity with the setting's lore. And finally, I'm going to give you some of the takeaways from my experience running this game myself. As always, I'm going to be using the PDF version of the game for the review. The first thing that might be a little off-putting for some folks is the fact that this rulebook runs 457 pages. But to my own personal relief, most of it isn't rules. Here's a breakdown of the contents by percentage of the entire book, more or less. Honestly, one of the little problems I have with this book is not the amount of detail put into this or that, but the names of a few of the chapters. I know that it doesn't seem like a big deal, but for example, calling character creation Fitted for the Future and the combat chapter Friday Night Firefight is just confusing. Like, do firefights only happen on Fridays at night? Is this a reference to the chapter names from the old Cyberpunk? It's just some unneeded friction in the reading and referencing experience here. There are a few chapters I would just rename for clarity's sake because the original names keep tripping me up. To be fair, this game's creators really did kill a lot of the darlings from the old Cyberpunk 2020 and made this an easier to play, more streamlined experience, chapter names aside. Some of the darlings they didn't kill were the 10 available roles that you can choose from. From the people I talked to who have played this game extensively, their one chief complaint about these 10 roles is that newer players tend to box themselves in after choosing a role for their character, when in most cases, your role doesn't really limit your character build all that much. Every role type has one particular ability that sets them apart from the rest. For example, a solo, who is like a mercenary for hire, has enhanced situational awareness and can temporarily boost abilities, which is cool. All the role abilities are cool, but the Netrunner's role ability interface makes them quite special because it gives them the ability to access a cyber deck, which in turn allows them access to locally networked computer systems. In other words, to do any sort of deep hacking in this game called net running, you need this interface ability, and only the netrunner starts with it. I'll get into the net running rules here in a minute and also show you some of the pretty in-depth role abilities that a few of the other roles have. One important thing to note about these role abilities is that they each have a rank of 1 to 10, and you can spend XP, which in this game comes in the form of IP or improvement points, to increase your role ability ranks. Your rank in your role ability is essentially your character's level, and you get tangible benefits with increased rank, the specifics of which depend on which role you've chosen. I'm not going to get too deep into character creation here, but I do want to point out a few really cool features in this book. The first is that the authors give you 3 methods to create a character: simple, medium, and complex. They have their own names for them, of course: Street Rat, Edge Runners, and the Complete Package. I think the names are a bit misleading because Street Rat and Edge Runner denote a type of character that you may or may not actually play as, but whatever. I rolled up a bunch of characters just for fun, and really the most fun in the Complete Package method is the life path, coming up with your backstory. It's really one of the crowning achievements of this game, being able to roll your way through all kinds of fun narrative details about your character. All of it culminating in this table, your life goal. You can always just make something up and not use this table, but these all just sort of have that cyberpunk genre feel to them. There are even more tables to nail down role-specific life path details, where you get 1 or 2 pages of tables to flesh out a backstory. Once you have all that down, you can either choose an array or buy your stats. This game is on the more granular side when it comes to stats and skills. There are 10 core stats, and fortunately, if you're in a hurry, you can just roll a d10 and pick a stat array depending on which role you've chosen. On the other side of the coin with stats is your character's skills. Anytime you're rolling a check in this game, you're rolling a d10 and adding your rating and a relevant skill plus the core stat that it's connected to. There are 9 skill categories, each containing 4 to 15 named skills. Under the education and performance categories, there are some sub-skills that you can name yourself. My big takeaway here after running this game is that this huge array of 66 named skills feels very old school, and there's no way new players and GMs are going to remember which skill can apply to the exact situation every time. In order for that to happen, at least one person at the table pretty much has to memorize this list of skills to be faithful to the rules. There is definitely a part of me that wishes there was a bit more consolidation. Like, do we need a paint, draw, sculpt skill specifically? Is pilot C vehicle really necessary to split from C vehicle tech? And the fact is, when you find yourself in an urban environment shooting at people, getting shot at, and hacking into computer systems, a good quarter of these skills will never come up. Anyway, you can quickly stock your character with starting skill ratings in some of these skills depending on which role you chose, or you can use one of the more advanced methods. There are a few notable things about the 10 roles that you can choose for your character. The first, and I think most important thing, is the fact that you can multi-class in this game. If you reach 4 ranks in your first role ability, you can start ranking up in a new role. And here's the second thing about roles. Some role abilities are more obviously applicable to the world of Cyberpunk than others. The Rocker Boy, Lawman, Media, and Fixer in particular, each have special abilities that require a bit more thinking and coordination with the GM in order to integrate them into the standard Cyberpunk environment. For example, with Rocker Boys, the Charismatic Impact ability requires that there are always fan NPCs hanging around for the ability to have any value. With Fixers, the Operator ability gives them haggle skills, which just won't come up very frequently in a game. Contacts could be useful, but it ends up being hard for GMs and players to figure out when and where those NPCs show up and how much information or influence they actually have. On the other side of the coin here are the abilities like Cryosystems Operation for the MedTech role. This is about as straightforward as it gets. It's just a skill that you level up from 1 to 10 and you can put people in stasis to heal them. The Teamwork ability for execs is also straightforward in terms of perks, but actually really in-depth in terms of how many perks you end up getting over time. At rank 1, you get a nice suit. And actually that may not seem like much, but in this setting, clothing has, or should have if you're running the game as intended, a huge impact on how NPCs treat you and what kinds of places and groups you have access to. At level 2, you get a nice apartment that can be upgraded to a nice house, and the house can get nicer and bigger after that. You also get health insurance, which involves a trauma team subscription. Trauma teams are this great concept in the setting where if you're insured with them and you get really hurt, an armored flying ambulance comes to get you, and it's full of elite combat medics who will stop at nothing to extract you to safety. Craziest of all for the execs is that you get team members. These are all specialist NPCs that work for you, and there's a whole subsystem in the game for tracking their loyalty to you as well as their stats and skills. Nomads basically get a vehicle that eventually grows into a fleet of vehicles. In the fiction, they don't necessarily own these vehicles outright. They belong to the nomad's tribe or family, but your character gets to use them whenever they want. And then of course there's the most notable role of all, interface, for netrunners. If you decide to play as a netrunner, it's pretty important that you really try to learn all of these interface abilities, because you'll have all of them at your disposal anytime you jack into a net architecture. Oh, and you'll also need to read the 20 pages of rules on netrunning. Netrunning, or what is essentially deep computer hacking, in this game is a relatively involved subsystem of rules. Essentially, any character who has the interface skill and a physical device called a cyberdeck can connect into a linear computer system and try to defeat its various defenses in order to usually do one of two things: gain control of a file that might have something important to do with the story, or control a building's systems in order to distract, attack, or disable. Rather than going through all of it, I just want to show you some of the most inspired aspects of netrunning in this game. The first is that they changed the nature of netrunning from Cyberpunk 2020 to where now the netrunner needs to be present at the site of the computer system which they are hacking. This keeps the party together, because in the old rules, the netrunner could just work remotely and you didn't have much group cohesion. And with a netrunner busy in a place of potential danger now, there is the added tension of trying to protect them while they are hacking. You can get some very cinematic moments with this new approach. The second interesting feature is that using one of your 9 interface abilities almost always just comes down to one roll, a D10 plus your interface rank, versus whatever the difficulty value is for the thing you're up against. This simplicity is important because netrunning already directs a lot of table time towards the player doing the netrunning. It was a problem in the past where overly complex netrunning rules gave that player way too much spotlight. So the relative simplicity has been most welcome. You have all of these different options, and as your interface rank goes up, you can do more and more of these per turn. Scanner allows you to find an access point in the first place. Backdoor is the counter to passwords. Cloak allows you to cover your tracks. Control gives you, well, control over control nodes, which means you can affect things like camera systems or turret arrays or fire sprinklers or whatever. ID is required to actually know what a file is after you found it. Pathfinder will reveal the whole net architecture to you so that you know the scope of the challenge, and that's one you're going to use a lot. And Slide is a way to run away from defense programs called Black Ice. But the most fascinating thing about netrunning is one particular interface ability, Virus. Is a very special action. It allows the player to come up with any kind of virus effects that they can think of to leave behind in a system, anything. And then it's up to the GM to decide how powerful that virus is, and then set a difficulty value for the player to beat with an interface plus D10 roll. In an RPG that is so traditional in almost every respect, I was surprised to see this much creative freedom being given to the player. It's really pretty brilliant. Netrunners have programs that they can deploy, which either boost their abilities, defend them, or attack other programs. Black Ice, or Intrusions, Countermeasures, Electronics, are attack programs that follow the netrunner between rooms, and they will need to either be de-resed or slid past. Note that there are 12 kinds of Black Ice in the core rulebook here. 9 of them are designed to harm the netrunner themselves, and 3 of them are designed to damage or destroy the netrunner's programs. Also notable are demons, which are like AI programs that you can almost think of as boss level programs, statted out almost like an NPC. They're harder to kill and impossible to evade. Here's a great list of environmental defenses that a secured building might have, and which a netrunner might be able to disable or turn against the enemy. These all remind me of the deadly traps you might find in a dungeon crawling adventure. As you might expect, the cyberware enhancements can get pretty involved. There are 8 types of cyberware, for example, and most of it is hard to come by for your character. The good stuff tends to be expensive and require certain facilities and personnel to install. And there's also this ultimate price of your limited humanity as a cost. For fashion wear like glowing tattoos and tech hair, you don't give up any of your precious humanity. But for everything else, you do. Humanity is based on how much empathy you start with, which is one of your core stats. If you started with 5 empathy, then you have 10 times that in humanity points. And essentially for every 10 humanity points that you lose, your empathy temporarily goes down by 1. Obviously, you really want some of this cyberware, not just because you're playing Cyberpunk, but because it can provide some really useful abilities for you as an edge runner. But the cost of losing all your humanity points is steep. In the world of Cyberpunk, trademark, there's a concept called cyberpsychosis, where if you take on too much trauma, including from installing too much cyberware, then your character enters increasingly distressful states of dissociation. As far as watching your character's psychological health degrade as your empathy stat hits 2 and then 1 and then 0, I do have to say that being asked to roleplay all these hallmarks of psychopathy seems a bit unpleasant. That unpleasantness, actually, is one of the main features of the Netflix anime show Cyberpunk Edgerunners, where we get to see Debito Martinez devolve into a desperate cyberware and drug-fueled state of really pretty spectacular self-destruction. It's cool to watch. I'm not sure how fun it is to roleplay, though. I think as an alternative, they could have just thrown some roll penalties at you as your empathy stat dwindles. Either way, having a Talon foot would be pretty dope. Alright, so here's how skill checks work in the game. Most every check comes down to adding your rating in a core stat plus a skill rating plus whatever you come up with on a D10 roll. If you're pitting your skill against another character's skill, then it's as simple as your stat plus skill plus D10 against theirs. And in the case of a tie, the defender always wins. In tests where the player is rolling against a situation, this table here describes that range of difficulty values that they need to beat, depending on the severity of the challenge. 13 to 17 DV is where a lot of situations land. Oh, by the way, if you roll a 1 on your D10 roll, you roll again and subtract the second roll from your total check score. There are no exploding dice here, so a rolled 10 and a rolled 1 on your first roll triggers a second roll, but there's never a third roll if you roll a 10 or 1 again. Combat in this game is pretty straightforward. You get 1 move and 1 action per turn. Actions include all of these things, and there are no surprises here. There are basically 2 kinds of attack, ranged and melee. For ranged attacks, you're using your reflex, stat, plus whatever relevant weapon skill, plus D10. The defender in a ranged attack will use a difficulty value based on the range of the attack and the weapon being used plus a D10. Or, and this is pretty notable, a defender can choose to dodge the projectile if they have a reflex stat of 8 or higher, in which case they can apply their dexterity stat and their evasion skill rating. This bullet dodging business has been complained about by some because you can pump up your reflex stat to the point that you're dodging shots all the time. For melee combat, it's the dexterity stat plus relevant melee skill plus D10 against the defender's dex plus evasion skill and a D10. A couple of interesting points with melee are that a successful such attack ignores half of a defendant's armor, and if your character has a body stat of 8 or higher, they can wield a 2-handed melee weapon in one hand. There are 2.5 pages dedicated to martial arts attacks, and although I have yet to put these into practice myself, I've been told that you get a lot of bang for your buck when investing in these particular skills. Min-maxers love them. Since this game had its start in the heady traditional days of the 1980s, it has the legacy of tons of rules minutia, but in practice you probably don't have to follow all the rules to the letter for the game to be fun and enjoyable. For example, the rules on human shields, like in action movies where the hero uses a body as a shield. Well, there are rules for how the turn economy is affected depending on if your human shield is alive or not. Just really nitpicky stuff like that. Meat shields don't really work in real life, by the way. Bullets often go right through the body, so don't try that. As far as taking damage, the rules for armor are going to come up every single time, so it's worth briefly covering here. When you take damage in this game, you will subtract the stopping power, or SP, of the armor you're wearing from the incoming damage. If any amount of damage actually reaches your body after the armor has reduced it, then the SP of that armor is reduced by 1. You can repair your armor, but it will ablate in this fashion each time you take damage. And as far as losing hit points, once you've reached 50% or less HP, you suffer a -2 to all actions. When you're down to less than 1 HP, you suffer a slew of penalties and have to make a death save each turn, wherein one failed death save and you're permanently dead. Death saves involve rolling a single d10 and trying to roll under your body stat score. If you roll equal to or higher than your body, that's a fail. I'm actually not even going to touch on the 20% of the core rulebook that is the incredible Cyberpunk world lore dump, except to say that by 2020 there was this World Wide Web sort of thing, but the megacorps went to war with each other, nukes were dropped, AI went nuts, and now computer networks are all small and localized. And the sky is red from all that war, which is why the era is called the Time of the Red, and the game takes its name from that as well. The lore goes deep and is really one of the value propositions of buying this book. I think generally speaking, the Cyberpunk trademark RPG has had a sort of home court advantage when comparing it to other Cyberpunk games because it's just been developed for since the late 1980s. And the stewards of this game, including co-creator Mike Pondsmith, have done a great job of maintaining consistency within the lore. Maybe the storyline of the setting doesn't do it for you personally, but you can't fault it for being disjointed. I think just as a study of how a company can approach community and product line support, it's important to look at R. Talsorian Games. Again, I'm not sponsored by these guys. This is just what I've observed. 1, they're active on social media. Their employees appear on podcasts and YouTube videos all the time. They release a free supplement PDF for Cyberpunk Red every month, and then eventually release collections of those monthly so-called DLCs as inexpensive print-on-demand softcover books. When they sold out of their GM screen and couldn't find a new printer, they discounted the PDF of the screen to $1. They run an official Discord server that is full of people very helpfully discussing and playing the game. They license their game out to video game studios and anime studios. I'm not sure this is as much a good guy thing as much as it's a privilege to be able to do this, since the Cyberpunk brand is so strong at this point, but the multimedia does help the RPG playing experience since it provides so many visual touchstones for players and GMs. I ran a game of Cyberpunk Red in preparation for this video. In particular, I really wanted to see the combat and the net running in action. I chose the scenario Agents of Desire from the Tales of the Street mission supplement. Kind of an odd coincidence here. When I was running this scenario, Seth Skorkowski actually published a video about this very same scenario, like while I was running it. Strange. Anyway, if you want a really great breakdown of the scenario, check out his video on it. In this video, I just want to give you my takeaways about the game's mechanics themselves. It was everyone's first time playing, so we all had a bit of difficulty running the combat and net running smoothly, but I'm pretty confident that we'd all be just fine with the mechanics by the second session. But combat does have some really weird elements to it. The first is that there is no bonus for point blank range or very close range ranged attacks. If you recall, ranged attack difficulties can be based on range, but the range zones are really very chunky. The closest range tier is 0 to 6 meters or yards. That's 0 to 18 feet, more or less. And an assault rifle is most likely to land a hit at 26 to 50 yards. This does not comport with the reality of assault rifles at all. The curve on most of these weapons actually don't make a lot of sense. One other issue our group ran into was the fact that armor soaks so much damage, and as long as you don't take any damage in an attack, that armor will continue to soak the same amount of damage on each attack. For us, this led to a lot of rounds where characters were trading blows and bullets, receiving the hit but taking 0 damage. The only solution I can think of here to speed things up is to just give all the characters more powerful weapons. The one last takeaway I had from my playthrough was that the huge number of skills was an impediment to fast, smooth gameplay. Like I mentioned earlier, this is a legacy holdover from the original Cyberpunk and reflects that older school style of RPG, where the character sheet is supposed to act as an exhaustive menu of all of your in-world actions, when in practice, it spreads your character out pretty thin and makes finding the right skill to apply to the situation a bit of a chore unless you have the whole thing memorized. Alright, so here are my remaining thoughts on Cyberpunk Red. Some cheese. Honestly, I'm not a fan of the name for the Rocker Boy role, and it's for a couple of reasons. One, Rocker Boy is just a really awkward name for an archetype. Maybe they could have gone with Rocker at least. But also, rock and roll is all but dead as a music genre these days. Even as this setting has evolved over the years with the artwork getting cooler and the multimedia showing inspiring new sights and sounds within the setting, we're expected to use the term rock here. The actual role of a rocker boy can include a very charismatic poet, artist, dancer, or even cult leader, all of which have nothing to do with rock. Cyberpunk, all the way back to the first Blade Runner movie, is really musically more associated with synthesizers and more recently with thumping electronic music. Also, this bit at the beginning laying out the rules for a Cyberpunk player, style over substance, attitude is everything, live on the edge, and then break the rules. This is super cheesy, but I do emphatically agree with rule number 4 in this case. Core rulebook is chonky. I think from a publisher standpoint, you know that customers perceive more pages as more value, so you want to sell them nice thick books. But in terms of actual usability, I don't want to have to haul around hundreds of pages of lore and other secondary information along with the rules that I actually need at the table. In a perfect world, they could have bifurcated this book into the stuff for the player and stuff for the GM. But actually, if you're more of a collector, then this book is a very attractive proposition because it so fully encompasses the core of Cyberpunk Red with all that lore and everything. Highly entertaining game. Look, the whole reason I even made this video was because for years I have been seeing commenters on the internet casually dismissing this game as unplayable and broken and using all these hyperbolic terms for how much R. Talsorian has lost its way. If you read enough comments like that, you almost start to take their word for it. But I'd also heard enough positive things about the game and I just had to find out for myself. So yeah, this game is a lot of fun. I don't think it deserves any of the dramatic criticisms that it receives from anonymous commenters. The game is fun. Character creation options are cool. I really appreciated the 3 levels of character creation complexity. You can make a PC in about 5 minutes or half an hour if you want to customize and control everything. Also, the role you choose for your character does give them a unique role ability, one that can be critical in the case of the Netrunner, but it doesn't really define your character that much. You still have endless build possibilities, regardless of your selected role. Multimedia fortified setting. I really dig the Cyberpunk 2077 video game, especially after the fact that the studio, CD Projekt Red, stayed committed to fixing all the bugs years after its release. Awesome story, awesome graphics, awesome sound effects, all of which can enhance a Cyberpunk Red game because the video game can help everyone at the table create a mental picture of what's happening. And the same goes for the Edgerunner anime series. Just utterly phenomenal animation quality, and maybe even more importantly, a reinforcement of the dark cyberpunk themes of losing one's humanity to cyberware and the futile struggle against evil corporations. Net running is compelling. I found the reworked net running rules to be really fun once you got the hang of it. It takes more commitment compared to other roles, but if the player is willing to do the reading and take the time to learn the action flow of a net run, then it ends up simulating hacking into a computer. I mean, ultimately, net running in this game is a grossly oversimplified portrayal of hacking, but you can't have too much complexity in a multiplayer tabletop role-playing game where everyone else has to wait for the netrunner's turn to finish. I think the designer struck the right balance of complexity. Handles cyber implants well. I would have never thought about this if it wasn't for the Edgerunners anime, but there is a cost to cyber implants in the game, a direct cost in humanity points. And at the end of that road is unpleasantness and then the loss of your character, which is how it should be. Since without such dire costs, players could and would just become overpowered, unstoppable cyborgs. GM section is incredible. I forgot to mention that the GM section in this core rulebook is one of the best I've ever come across. It starts off explaining some basic concepts about the genre of cyberpunk, principles like setting the game in an urban environment, making an atmosphere of moral ambiguity, but then it explains different playgroup types and follows that up by a crazy comprehensive treatise on the different components of a scenario. It's practically a manual on story design, but always focused on the cyberpunk genre. It's really a masterpiece in GM sections. Supplements make this game utterly comprehensive. I asked a number of CBR veterans what their favorite supplements are so far and got a bunch of answers. Black Chrome is huge if you want to broaden your horizons on gear and weapons. Danger Gal Dossier is a faction and NPC guide that a lot of folks have been really inspired by. And Tales of the Red Street Stories has 9 fully described missions, including the one I used for my one-shot because the underlying story there was so interesting. So there you have it, Cyberpunk Red. I think it's an important game in the cyberpunk genre because it's so complete and it's so full of intention and polished execution, but also because it's got so much behind it. The supplements for the older editions are all mostly compatible. There's the video game and the anime series to get your visual cortex fired up. And there's a huge community of fans who will answer all of your questions and discuss anything about the game late into the night. It's really a complete game in every sense of the word. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Cyberpunk Red and what your experience has been like. Let me know down in the comments. I've left links for everything. Thanks for watching. See ya.